Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Roy, and I am a co-chair of the Women's Leadership Initiative for WLI St. Louis. I see the number of attendees growing, so I want to welcome you all on behalf of the Women's Leadership Initiative, or WLI, Regional Summit Planning Committee. This is the first of a three-part series focused on equity in land use and leadership. As some of you know or may know, the inaugural WLI Regional Summit was a great success in the fall of 2019, hosted by ULI Kentucky and St. Louis. St. Louis was planning to host, in Louisville. St. Louis was planning to host the second summit right about now, or last week actually, but postponed to August 2021 due to COVID-19. As a way to engage and continue the conversation, discussing relevant topics and fostering an inclusive network for challenging and important conversations, we curated this three-part virtual series entitled Acknowledgement to Action. We have over 375 registered for today's discussion, and we look forward to how these conversations will also help our committee shape the content for the 2021 summit. You can find out more about this series in the 2020 summit being planned by going to the link you see at the bottom of the screen, wlisummit.uli.org. Before we jump into today's agenda and continue to see those numbers of attendees rise, I'll provide a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sure we're all getting very familiar with how Zoom works these days, but some of you may not be quite as familiar with the webinar format. Most of the tools will be at the bottom of your screen. We will be utilizing the Q&A feature. We encourage you to enter questions or thoughts you have at any point during the webinar. We will be using an upvote feature. There's a thumbs up that you'll be able to click to prioritize those questions. And when we get to Q&A at the end of the webinar, we will start with those that have had the most upvotes. The chat feature is disabled. And as an attendee, your video and your audio will remain off or muted. Finally, we'll also be asking a few polling questions, and the poll will just pop up on your screen. You'll have a few moments to respond to that poll, and then we'll share the results live with the group. Today's agenda will begin with introductions. We'll watch a short video followed by discussion between our panelists. We'll conclude with a Q&A. I want to thank our panelists and our moderator for their time and commitment. I also want to thank our St. Louis ULI District Council Executive Director, Kelly Annis. Without Kelly consistently helping us get across the finish line with all of our wild ideas, we would be nowhere. She will also be behind the scenes with me and Katie Shackelford, who you will meet here in just a minute to help with the Q&A of today's webinar. I also want to thank our WLI regional partners, specifically in Indianapolis and Kansas City, who have helped to curate this virtual series. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my St. Louis WLI colleague, Katie Shackelford. Katie's an urban planner specializing in transportation, economic development, and public policy. Katie's been a champion for fostering this venue for these important conversations. Katie, are you ready to kick things off?
I'm ready. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you all for being here. And just to let you know, we are aware I have a little echo. You'll have to bear with us. So as Bonnie mentioned, we had planned to be hosting an in-person conference at this time. That postponement and the pivot to the online format gave us this opportunity to look more critically as individuals and professionals and as the WLI committee at our approach to equity and inclusion. We were challenged very early on in this process by a young planner locally known as Grace Young. She asked us to define equity for this conference. I think we can all agree as a committee that was the hardest assignment we'd ever been given. We struggled with it and we are still struggling with it. Through that process, though, we realized, despite our best intentions, that we were perpetuating the very problem we were working to solve. Our leadership was composed almost exclusively of white women, a group that has benefited the most from the work of diversity and inclusion programs in the world. We were not actively recruiting or collaborating with our Black and brown colleagues, and in short, we needed to do the work. What you will experience with us today is that work in progress. We invite you to join the conversation and to walk with us as we push this conversation towards meaningful change. The purpose of today's session is to establish a foundation for a dialogue on equity in land use and leadership. We recognize that our participants today come to us from a variety of backgrounds, professions, and walks of life. Maybe you're here because you're curious. Maybe you're here because you're skeptical and you thought we've already moved past the race issue. Maybe you're cautiously exploring this topic for the first time, or you're beginning to view your work through a lens of racial equity. For others, you've been here and you recognize the problems. You're looking for guidance and partners to move through this work. And yet for others still, we know racial discrimination in the built environment is part of your lived experience. And for you, we know that action is long overdue. So from wherever you join us, we welcome you. For those further along in this process, we ask for your patience as we know some of this information you might hear is redundant. As our series titles imply, our goal is to move from acknowledgement to action. We hope to meet people where they are, but we do not intend to leave them there. This forum is meant to be a safe and judgment-free space. We encourage you to be curious and self-reflective and to ask questions in that Q&A box. After all, curiosity is the cure for ignorance. Some of what you may hear may make you feel uncomfortable. I ask that you be open to this discomfort and embrace it, sit with it, and recognize that when we acknowledge the things that make us feel unpleasant, we are moving towards action and change. Today's session is going to begin with a clip from the video Segregated by Design, based on the book The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Before we begin, though, we ask that you take a moment to answer the poll question on your screen. And as Kelly gets that started, you should see a box appear on your screen that allows you to take a poll. While it's live, I will say there are some things we'd ask you to consider while the video is running. What are you hoping to get out of today's session? How do you define equity? How does your company define equity? How do your clients define equity? What are we lacking about equity and inclusion what are we being prevented from achieving because we are not doing the work? So Kelly, I will ask if that poll is live, we can now close it down and show the results. Unfortunately, I cannot see this poll or the results, so I hope that it's going well.
Katie, I can help you out. We had the majority voted that housing was 76% of where they see impact in these policies, followed by economic development at 57% and education at 53%.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. So now that that poll has wrapped up, let's move on to the video.
Led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known, but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and the project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540 square foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market.
All right, welcome back. We're going to be launching our second poll question now. What you'll notice is that the poll questions were lumped together, so you'll need to scroll down to see the second question. We're going to do this before moving on to the panel portion of our session. So if you scroll down, you'll see our second question, which is, How often do you think about these policies or issues in your day-to-day work? And we ask that you select one. As you reflect on the video that we just saw, I just want you to think about what's your first reaction? What are your thoughts about this video? If you were wishing to watch this video in its entirety, it's about 17 minutes long. It's available on the website you noticed. We also sent a link with the registration, and then it's available on YouTube if you search. So at this point, we're going to end the poll. It looks like, as a result, how often do you think about this? Multiple times a day. That's nearly half of our audience. That's wonderful. And we have 8% rarely to monthly, some even weekly. So thank you for participating in that. We'll close the poll. As we move on to the panel discussion, you'll be able to submit and upvote questions in the question and answer box. We encourage you to use this feature, and we'll be pulling the questions from the audience at the end of this session to ask for the panelists. Now, please allow me the pleasure of introducing our moderator for today's discussion, Brian Hurd. Brian is an adjunct professor of planning, sustainability, and racial equitable, he's a adjunct professor of planning, sustainable, and racially equitable urban communities at Washington University in St. Louis, University College in the Sustainability Program. From lifelong personal experience and with nearly 25 years of professional practice, Brian H. Hurd is the leader of the Center of Equitable Planning, Relationship-Oriented Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. Brian is a St. Louis-based consultant and trainer, as well as an adjunct professor in field instruction at Washington University in St. Louis. He teaches a class entitled Planning Sustainable and Racially Equitable Urban Communities. His work involves integrating the equity lens that addresses race and its adverse impacts on social and physical determinants of health, including the undervaluation and marginalization of people and communities of color. As demographics continue to change, Brian understands the decisions and actions made today must be driven by equity, intentional, just, fair, and inclusive. Brian is also a recent best-selling author with his new book release, Dream It, Plan It, Be It, a playbook for today's youth. The book addresses developing and inspiring young emerging leaders, calls to action by parents, community leaders, and policymakers, and his mission of building youth-centered, healthy communities by aligning planning, investment, and partnerships to meet today's challenges. Please join me in welcoming Brian Hurd.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, Katie, and to you, Bonnie, as well. Thank you for putting this program together. For all the participants, I say welcome. To the Urban Land Institute Women's Leadership Initiative, again, I just want to thank you for allowing me to serve as your moderator over this three-part series addressing equity and land use and leadership. Let me begin with this preface. Decisions and actions involving land use have been unfairly embedded within policies and practices to segregate people intentionally and historically. The result is the stripping of resources, opportunities, and access for Black households, families, and youth, which adversely impact social and physical determinants of health. This is undeniable, as witnessed by the COVID-19 pandemic and how it is exposing racial disparities. Acknowledging the true legacy of racism is the first step. Members of the Urban Land Institute will have to acknowledge racism before attempting to analyze or take any action. Lacking that historical and cultural empathy could be harmful even when trying to do good. The responsibility of being anti-racist can no longer be ignored. Being anti-racist means that one actively opposes racism and aggressively promotes racial tolerance in their values, decision-making, and actions. The great Booker T. Washington, an African-American educator and advisor to several US presidents, once said, "There are two ways of exerting one's strength. One is pushing down, the other is pulling up." As we begin to take this journey of race, equity, land use, and leadership, ask yourself these two questions. One, what am I pushing down? And two, what am I pulling up? While you contemplate those two questions over the next 2-month journey, let us begin at the starting line here today with acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is the first session of our 3-part series. To help us, I want to introduce our group of esteemed panelists from different communities around the Midwest region. Our panelists bring unique perspectives through their professional and personal lenses, as well as experiences. First, from St. Louis, is Phillip Sangokoya, a management consultant and co-founder for for Brand of St. Louis. From Chicago is Monica Chadha, founder and principal of Civic Projects. And last but not least, from Indianapolis is Breanca Merritt, who is the director of the Center for Research on Inclusion and Social Policy, as well as a clinical assistant professor at Indiana University's Public Policy Institute. As we go into this panel discussion, I want to ask each one of our three panelists, beginning with Phillip, followed by Monica, and then last but not least, as I mentioned, Breanca, to share a few minutes about your biography and how it relates to the work that you're doing in your respective community. And with that being the basis, please also answer the question at hand. From your perspective, why is it important to acknowledge racism and institutional structures that foster and perpetuate its existence when it comes to land use? Phillip, you have the floor.
Thanks, Brian. First of all, I really do appreciate the time with everyone here on the call to talk about this important conversation ongoing. And, I really appreciate the willingness to have the conversation on ULI's behalf. I really do want to maybe just give a little bit of background. I have been in St. Louis for over 10 years now, but I was born and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I came up to Washington University for school. I've had about 5 years in business banking and commercial banking experience, really looking at that lending piece, whether it's small business lending or affordable housing or real estate lending. And then also have had some experience with new market tax credit lending, tied to some of those tax credit deals that include historic tax credits, as well as other tax credits. Also, just really now in my current role at US Bank CDC, I'm doing lending to community development financial institutions. So those are a lot of those CDFI organizations that tend to be those intermediary lenders in underserved communities. As mentioned, I also co-founded Brand of St. Louis, which is a social enterprise that focuses on racial equity in the entrepreneurship ecosystem here in St. Louis. I feel like, really with a lot of my experience here in St. Louis, I've noticed that, it's crucial to focus on racial equity when it comes to land use, just to kind of understand the historical context around what was not made available to all people, knowing that a lot of the organizations that were responsible were government agencies. And I think, that comes into play when we talk about accountability, because tax-paying dollars go to government agencies, and those dollars should be used in an equitable way. So I think that's kind of where I've seen it, whether it's from a lending perspective or even just from working with some community development groups locally. You've seen issues come up like appraisals, and I'm sure we'll get into more of that down the road. But, that's really something that is critical. And I think the biggest thing for me as a takeaway is that racial discrimination became coded language and turned into socioeconomic discrimination. And I think once it became coded in that way, where it wasn't explicitly calling out race, it becomes harder to pull out and harder to call out and identify. And I think that just makes things more difficult to kind of see where the issues lie. But I think we have a lot of us, even on this call, who can kind of help with our own special fields to kind of see and unpeel those layers back.
Thank you, Phillip. And now we'll go to Monica.
Hello, thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this important conversation. Welcome, everyone. So my name is Monica Chadha. I am principal founder of Civic Projects Architecture here in Chicago. And one of the roots or foundations of our practice is that we do work through listening, engaging, and understanding needs prior to getting into things like traditional architecture or more programmatic design. And the reason I'm saying that is I think that is going to be very germane to our conversation. So as an architectural practice, we really believe in working from before the beginning, so to speak, and then through and realizing projects through to actualization. The reason I'm saying this is because when we talk about sort of land use access, all of the issues at hand, what we're finding, especially with lending institutions, but in neighborhoods, kind of access to opportunities, whether that's ownership, bidding on properties, whether that's the development, whether that's from construction and jobs side, there's been a limit to access. I can send some links with statistics cited in Chicago, but Chicago has situations where you can take entire swaths of the South Side that have not had the same amount of investment that perhaps one neighborhood on the North Side has had. So we're both, we're located in Woodlawn. We're sort of feel like we're a critical player to the discussion, happy to be a participant, but also recognize we are one of the people that are coming into neighborhoods. So the understanding and participation and role of neighborhood communities and engagement is absolutely critical to our work, because we are not of all of the neighborhoods that we work in. And I think that recognition also ties to the discussion we're having today.
Thank you, Monica. And again, last but not least, from Indianapolis is Breanca Merritt. Breanca.
Hey everyone, again, as the other panelists have said, thanks for the opportunity to join you all today. Per my bio, actually this isn't in my bio, like Phillip, I'm actually from Louisiana as well. I'm from Shreveport, and I grew up in a situation where I had a grandfather who was one of the first Black real estate brokers in the state. And on the other side of my family, I'm having a lot of folks who grew up in housing projects that were built on a creosote plant, which is a carcinogen. And so watching these very different experiences and the effects of that growing up was really powerful in shaping how I view the role of policy and equity-based decisions. So my work is focused on the fact that we do have inequitable outcomes, but that it's not just a function of one policy area, it's the fact that they all very much overlap. And a lot of my work is community engaged as well. And so what we do at our center, the Center for Research on Inclusion and Social Policy, is we conduct community relevant research, meaning that we want to work with residents, stakeholders, policymakers to understand what the major issues are happening locally so that we can inform that. And so we believe, again, that these issues are very complex and overlapping. So even when we're dealing with housing, what it means to be an effective renter, the fact that that also corresponds with employment policy, criminal history. If you're a person who has a criminal record and you can't rent because your landlord might discriminate against you based on those types of characteristics. And so having people at the table who can speak to those different perspectives to ensure that even if it's a housing issue, for example, that we're aware of everything that goes into that. So our work spans a variety of areas. As it relates to housing specifically, we do a lot of work kind of with the absolutely most vulnerable, all the way up to folks who are homeowners. So we do a lot of work in homelessness, doing the annual point in time count, working with people who are housing unstable, whether it's they're on the verge of eviction or just living kind of renting month to month, trying to make ends meet, all the way up again to folks who are dealing in the development, new market tax credits, et cetera. I think to answer the first question about, why this is so important is, as I've alluded to before, even when we think about land use policy and other things related to housing as it relates to race, that it's really not just about land use, it's about everything else, and how, as the poll question showed, these things affect every decision that we make. And I think for people of color and Black folks in particular, we feel the strongest, most adverse effects of those types of policy decisions. And to operate and act as if some of these policies happen in a land use, zoning, housing vacuum really does disservice to the many ways in which racism through policy really infiltrates and influences a lot of different parts of folks' lives, not just from a housing or a land use perspective.
Thank you. We have about 165 participants, and so we would like to ask you if you do have any questions at this time to please provide those in the Q&A box, and we will have someone who will read those questions as we go along. Again, this is for you. We want to turn this into a conversation, although this is a panel discussion, because again, we're all here to acknowledge, learn, and grow from one another during that aspect. But I'll start off with one question in particular. Obviously, this summer has been a very trying time for many parts of the country, or in the entire nation, as you know, from the COVID-19, but also some events. And when we talk about a movement, often a movement begins with a moment. And in 2020, Mr. George Floyd tragically lost his life. And that created protests, led to protests. It also led to a lot of corporations, a lot of organizations releasing a lot of public statements about what Black lives and how that matters, about racism. From your position, what do you feel about some of those public statements? And again, this is the broader society, but as it relates to some of the things talked about around banking and finance and looking at the inequities around neighborhoods and communities with redlining, environmental racism. What are your general thoughts about the public statements that have been released? Let me start with you, Breanca, and go back to you first.
I think it really varies. I think nationally, you see kind of a mix of different levels. I think there's a national conversation, state, city to city, and there's kind of these institutional and organizational statements as well. I think in Indy, it's been really interesting seeing how we're a city that has a very strong nonprofit and philanthropic community, and the ways that they came out in a different way than our public institutions came out. So I find that really interesting. I think having worked with a lot of those different organizations, that it is a little empty. I think that it's for two reasons. One, now it's okay to say things like Black Lives Matter and to care very much or be perceived as if you care about some of these systemically racist issues. But I don't think there's a lot of tools or knowledge about how to address them. So some of them I think are vague because they just kind of wanted to be some of the first people to say something. And then there are other folks who want to be first, but actually really want to do the work and figure out how to address these things, and that takes a long time. So I think there's also one of the big things that we've seen, at least in India, is kind of this disconnect between nonprofits and other groups. You know, the government, city government saying, you know, racism is a public health issue and really coming out against things, but then kind of matching that with action. And I think the statements can kind of seem very symbolic, but to see the work actually being done, I think is going to take some time. And so that disconnect between community residents understanding how long it takes to actually see policy change versus, you know, the folks who are trying to get on board and coalesce around it. I think at least in Indianapolis, there is some progress, but it's going to take a long time to see those inclusion and diversity statements actually match the reality, especially if folks aren't really willing to do the work to get there.
Good point. We'll move the questions around, but I did want to give Monica and Phillip a chance to respond to that as well. Public statements, what are your thoughts about it in general?
Sure, yeah, a couple
Go ahead,
points.
Phillip.
Okay, couple points here. You know, in my mind, you know, it's really about following the money. And, you know, I know that's a banker answer, but I think it definitely will see where people's responsibilities and accountabilities lie is if you look at budgets of organizations and what they spend those budgets on, and who that money goes to and what that work goes to. So I think as people are coming out with those statements, hopefully they're also re-looking at where those budgets are being allocated, right? And I think the other piece is just, you know, looking at the racial demographics of the organization. And, you know, that's comparing the racial demographics of the leadership and the board, compare that to the staff, you know, maybe that most entry-level position. And then on top of that, then compare that data to what do the racial demographics of the communities that they serve look like. And, you know, in an ideal world, all of those will look proportionate, right? And I think that's where the real work is. And I think I appreciate organizations who have that transparent in their statements that they're not necessarily there yet, and this is where they're working towards. And I think that's the most authentic.
I think that's actually a really great point to build off of, because I'll be honest, I've had very mixed views and often negative about some of the statements that are coming out from organizations, and primarily because some of the loudest speakers and earliest people to put out statements were not necessarily reflecting, Phillip, what you just talked about, right? Like, I will make a statement about equity and support of diversity and inclusion, the, you know, organization ABC, but when you actually look at where the lending goes, or look at who's on the board, or look at who's in leadership, it just does not reflect the statement. So I think for me, I got very frustrated very early with the statements. But I think what the quieter role has been those who are actually doing the work. So Breanca, to part of what you started to say is that someone who's rolling up their sleeves and doing the work actually doesn't necessarily have time to sit and put out public statements. They're busy doing the work. And I think that's really, really important to recognize, because in Chicago, you can imagine and have heard and seen all sorts of spectrums of what we're talking about. And the distinction between who's rolling up their sleeves, who's doing the action, who is protesting or asking for policy change or advocating is not what you're seeing sort of in the news in the day-to-day, whether it's through positive statements or through looting and other actions that are going on. And I think we have to collectively work on, particularly when we're talking about sort of design, built environment, lending and policy, really work on elevating those that are doing the hard work in positive ways.
Yeah, one of the things I find very interesting from some of the public statements, and I think all of you have touched on it, is that we go back to that saying, trust but verify. There were a lot of commitments that have been made, but the question is, who's measuring those goals, and how do they verify that information to the public so that the public has confidence in what they're proposing or what they're stating in those statements. So thank you for those questions. I think for our production staff, we have a few questions that have been asked by some of the participants.
Yes, Brian, this is Katie, and I just want to share with you the first open question, and this can go to anyone on the panel, but are there cities, MPOs, or other government organizations that you can point to that are taking an exemplary approach to equity at this time?
That's a good question. Have any of your work, point of view 3, anything that you want to share on that?
I don't know about exemplary. I think that people are really doing their best, whatever that looks like. I mean, like to Monica's point, there's some people who just put it out there. They're not going to do anything. Some organizations and governments, but I will say that there are some interesting offices and approaches. So there's the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which is a national group that helps local governments kind of, I think to Brian's point, hold themselves accountable for equity and develop metrics and try and figure out ways to integrate that throughout. So I know the city of Indianapolis has been working with them to help kind of work through where they can be more equitable. So when they had a meeting yesterday, I think a budget meeting, where they were showing, to Phillip's point, how they were allocating funding to be more equitable across different agencies within the city. And so I think that's a very important first step, to just kind of look at the data, acknowledge where the gaps are, and then try to invest in it. The state of Virginia has developed an equity, I think it's like a cabinet level position in the state of Virginia that deals with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And her role is to go through and actually pick through policies and practices across the entire state to try and figure out what that looks like, what it means to revise that. And I think, again, this process is really slow moving, so I can't say, and our other panelists might have better ideas than I do about. I know what it looks like and what it should look like. I also know that means that it takes a long time for them to actually do this assessment, especially in places that have not really come to grips with what it means to do things in an equitable way. And I will say that I think we have a long way to go with that in terms of housing and land use policy in particular. And so while there might be other policy areas that are a little more transparent and easy to address, I think with housing and land use, it opens up a can of worms in terms of how you kind of reverse the decades and decades of inequities that have happened there. And so I don't have good examples there, but the other panelists might.
Those are good examples that you at least shared. Again, the jury is always out on being exemplary, but we will continue to revisit that over time. I'm sure you will do it in your research as well as all of us. Monica, do you have anything you would like to share on that?
I think I was going to add, so there's a couple things. City of Chicago has recently created a couple of specific positions to try to, on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think is a promising start, right? Like city acknowledgement that these are issues that we need to approach citywide, and we're not just dealing in a specific community or a specific neighborhood. The other thing, and Phillip, I'm imagining you can speak more to this, is some of the funding, right, the city funding and also foundation funding. So there's sort of two separate moments, but we have an initiative called Invest Southwest here that is taking, literally taking downtown dollars and pushing to the neighborhoods. And with the current leadership that we have with Commissioner Cox, Mayor Lightfoot, this is active and transparent in a way that it hasn't been in the past. It's in very early stages, so the hard work is sort of starting to be done. On the foundation part, what I'm finding, a couple of organizations that I'm on boards for are being asked to be accountable and reflect the neighborhoods that they're working in. So as an example, foundations are starting to literally ask some of the things that have come up. It's like, who is your staff? Who is working in the neighborhoods? What relationship and what investment do you have in the neighborhoods that we should fund you as opposed to perhaps a different organization or someone who's more locally based? And what it's forcing, at least in a couple of instances, is better partnerships and better relationships where the local organization may be getting elevated and be in a stronger position because they are actually the ones who are receiving the funding and being supported. But it's a question that wasn't asked several years ago, right? It's being asked now and it wasn't asked historically.
Exactly.
I did want to jump in really quickly before Phillip, just to piggyback off of that, because I did mention that Indy has a strong foundation community. And so we have the Central Indiana Community Foundation, which a couple of years ago changed its entire mission to be about racial equity. So they were really on the forefront of, again, when it comes to providing nonprofits with funding as an intermediary, making sure that it's equitable in the work that they're doing. But then also just last week, I believe, the Lilly Endowment, which is a major funder, gave $100 million to the Indianapolis Urban League, specifically to address issues in Black communities. And I think that's like the biggest gift that we've seen nationally. Like the National Urban League also weighed in on that. And so I think, again, back to putting your money where your mouth is, they're giving it to community organizations to figure out, they're going to do a process to understand where the needs are and again, figure out how to invest that money meaningfully, which could involve housing related issues as well.
Good. Phillip?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think to Monica's point, the most important thing is how often do funders and lenders do their due diligence on the people that they do fund to make sure that they are looking into the community. And I think that's easier said than done, right? Because the best applications, the best submissions are going to be from people who have large scale capacity as an organization, which might mean that maybe they are less communicating with the community groups on the ground, right? So I think those smaller scale community groups might have the closest ear to the ground, so to speak, but it takes collaborating with those larger groups who might be getting the funding. So I think the more we can do more incentivizing around collaborations for certain funds and certain capital, the better. And that'll kind of free up those larger community groups to look to those smaller groups, and I'm a true entrepreneur at heart as well. And I do believe that those smaller groups are the ones who have the better ideas of the community needs, and yet they need the scale of the larger groups. So I think that's where I've seen, I know Invest STL in St. Louis has done a great job kind of looking at that intentional approach of how do we invest towards community engagement while still allowing the residents in the area to really kind of lead that effort. So that's been one that I've noticed. And then, just in general, participatory budgeting, the idea of that communities can come together to really vote on how money should be spent, I think is an important piece there.
That's great, great. Katie, we have another question?
Yes. So this is a combination of two questions, and this is for all the panelists. We've discussed today redlining and some of the other practices in the video, but how do those impact transportation and transit? How can we work to rebuild our cities more equitably? And specifically in Indianapolis, how does the bus rapid transit line impact or improve, or does it do anything? So that's two questions we kind of combined into one. So interested in your thoughts on that.
So let me leave the second part of the question about Indianapolis to Breanca, but before we do that, Breanca, give you some time to think about that. It seems like you may be ready to go already, but let me go to Monica. Monica, from your understanding of redlining and transit, what are you seeing in terms of the impacts of transportation as it relates to a consortium of things: transportation cost burden, redlining. We know more and more large companies that are going into metropolitan areas are locating in the suburbs because they want more space, but that demand and having the workforce to get people there is a challenge. But what are your general thoughts about redlining and transit?
Well, they're absolutely interrelated. I mean, what we're seeing in Chicago is things like neighborhoods that are maybe more of that industrial Brooklyn look and feel are getting the new transit stations and getting the improved amenities. And some of the places where the housing is more in need of improvement and has the opportunity to increase some of the density that would allow proximity between transportation and job locations are actually not getting those same resources. I mean, you can literally map train station by station where the improvements are occurring and where the new construction is occurring. And then to add to that, I mean, one super simple example that started is when the Divvy bikes started in Chicago, so the rideshare bikes, there was a big fight to have it equitably extend between neighborhoods and to neighborhoods that were underserved. But what it didn't recognize, which is to the point of equity, so I'm jumping sort of to an earlier question, is that some of the communities that were being underserved by the ride shares, even when the rideshare program started to come to allow that last, the last 5-15 minutes to get to the train, there was maybe less knowledge and less ability and less comfort to get on the bike to use it as a source of transit. So then it becomes a circular argument. It's like, hey, nobody's using this in the neighborhood, so why do we have to keep maintaining this in this particular neighborhood, without recognizing there's just some rooted experiences that may not be nascent to the communities where these services are being introduced.
Very good. Phillip, you want to chime in on anything regarding transit redlining?
Sure. That's a complicated question, because I think in my mind, it begs more questions. And I'll just maybe start with the idea of coded language, right? I think a lot of times people say that they want access to all communities and transportation that can help with that access to all communities. But there's also, conversations that not all communities want their community to be accessible to everyone in the region. And I think that's a tough reality that we have to acknowledge before we can have a transportation conversation, because then, politics will come into play, and then you really just have to go back to that initial question of, do we want access for all communities? And that goes back to segregation. I think there's a lot of communities who may not necessarily want every community member in the region to be able to get to their neighborhood, and they'll vote accordingly. Frankly.
Very good. Breanca, it seems like someone from Indianapolis, or somebody who's had some experience in Indianapolis, brought up the local transit system and redlining. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, we do have a bus rapid transit system that was developed that rolled out formally last fall around September-ish. And it's been interesting in that it has also, first of all, Indy is not a transit-friendly city. So we are definitely not a Chicago by any means. We also have state legislation that says that we are not allowed to build light rail. So, working around that, bus rapid transit is an option. But it rolled out in September in a city that's not really transit-friendly or bus-friendly in particular. And then complicating that, of course, was COVID-19, right? So you go from rolling out this new opportunity for residents to we can't even ride the buses, or we shouldn't ride the buses. So one of the things that they were dealing with, I think, in the early stages of this project, thinking about equity, is really how to get folks who don't ordinarily ride the bus to participate in the program and to ride the bus to downtown. And so I think part of their marketing also involved, the fact that you can live in your nice upscale neighborhood and catch the bus to go downtown. So part of it was trying to get those folks involved. And I think in this initial line that they have currently, it runs through a lot of relatively affluent and popular places in the city, through downtown and to the other side, the south side of the city. But it's an interesting experience riding it. I live on the north side, which is like the first stop. And as you keep going, it takes a while for you to get to see a person of color sometimes on that bus ride. And so even though I think there are places where they've clearly put it to make it more accessible, particularly for people of color, due to redlining, right? They do have 2 other lines that are supposed to come out, and I think more effectively connect communities of color in particular to more stops. And so I think, of course, the idea of these lines is to create more accessibility for folks who are lower income and need access to jobs. That obviously intersects with race sometimes. So I think our city is still probably needing to see more longer term effects, because like I said, I think COVID really complicated how that rolled out in terms of a broader audience and usability. But it does seem, at least on its face, it's still hitting some of those major areas where we do see more folks of color in our city.
Sounds like you all are a little bit further ahead of St. Louis, but that's good to hear.
Right. Okay, Katie, next question.
Yep. So this question is really focused, Phillip, with your banking experience. What our panelist or our participant Rob has asked, as an African-American worker in economic development, he meets with Black business owners and they express their concern struggling to secure bank loans. What are some of the ways you've seen Black business owners overcome this hurdle?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's definitely tough. And, you know, again, it kind of goes back to the historical context that there are a lot of walls and hurdles and tape, if you will, that, you know, the banking industry has kind of put up to say, hey, we want to be, you know, the most conservative with who we lend the money to. And we're using things like credit scores, we're using things like appraisals to kind of be that determinant, versus maybe some may say it should be the trust and the relationship that you have with the business owner, trusting that they are going to then pay it back. So it just depends on the banking industry, how strict they abide by those policies. And at the end of the day, if your credit scores or if appraisals don't come back where it kind of fits in bankers' metrics and in their credit box, if you will, there's very limited flexibility sometimes. So I think kind of building on other people's kind of comments in the chat, a lot of times the banking industry will rely on community development financial institutions, which are intermediary lenders, to say, hey, because we know you guys are a little bit more flexible with your credit box, we will give you all capital, and then in hopes that those CDFIs are going to kind of get it to those communities in a better way than banks can do. So that's kind of the current relationship there. But yeah, it's definitely an industry in banking that has been intentionally conservative to kind of make sure that they are being fiscally responsible, right? That's going to be what is said. And yet we know that there's historical context that banking industry has had its hand along with the FHA around redlining. So I think the fact that a lot of banks would not consider a non-FHA mortgage loan, and then knowing that FHA, kind of to the video's perspective, was very restrictive on who they gave that insurance to, I think it's kind of clear where our historical context is with banking.
I can just chime in as well, Phillip, from the other side, from the business. I think it's a great question. I think a lot of Black-owned businesses also need some support and advocacy from the community as well. It's tough for a lot of Black-owned businesses to go into a bank, first of all, because they may not have that historic relationship. They feel like they're going to get turned down no matter what, regardless. So I think it's important for some civic leaders to really get behind some of these Black-owned businesses and just advocate and try to do what they can to provide mentorship in some cases. And then there are other, Black-owned firms that may have a strong relationship and can do some things. So there's always a balance of just being strong support, having a strong support system, having that infrastructure for minority business development, particularly as we relate to Black-owned businesses, particularly those that are local, in hyper-local communities, meaning Black neighborhoods. It's very important that banks try to become innovative, but also civic leaders and government can get involved as well as the philanthropic community. Okay, did Breanca or Monica want to share anything, or if not, we can go to the next question.
I was just going to really quickly add with the CDFI point that Phillip's making is that's been absolutely critical for us. So part of what we do, less so under the name of civic projects, but as part of my work, is development, rehab, providing affordable housing in neighborhoods. And the only way we could start that through private money was with the CDFI, Community Investment Corporation, allowing us to get a loan in an under-resourced neighborhood. And that there was at that time probably no traditional bank that would have provided that funding. And that obviously helps grow. But I do find that with the bank and institutional lending, when you're coming in from private, so not the housing tax credits, not the historical credits, it is very difficult to enter that, and people don't have the language and knowledge to know how to have that conversation. Because when you start breaking it down, there is opportunity to leverage, whether it's property or savings, or there are opportunities, but Brian, to your point, some of the language and education and knowledge of just how to do that is not transparent, right? Nobody's making that process transparent to make it easier for more people.
Right, very good.
Yeah, I was just going to add that the Indy Chamber has kind of been lifted up as a national model because of their response to the PPP loans for small businesses in Indianapolis. And so I think upwards of 70% of the folks who got funding were actually minority and women-owned businesses. And so they're being held up as kind of examining their processes to see how to be more equitable in those types of disbursements and treating it as more of like a micro-lending situation and acting as a CDFI, working with CDFIs to do that work. But I do want to add that they're very intentional about being more equitable, and they've been doing work for probably about 2 to 3 years about how to be more inclusive in their growth strategies for the city. And so I just wanted to use that as a point for people to look that up if they're interested, but also that they've been very intentional about promoting equity through the business community for a while prior to all of this happening.
We have about 25 minutes before we have to begin to start wrapping up. And I know we have a number of questions, so we're going to try to move through some of these. Katie, you want to go with the next question?
Yes. Our next question is a very, very controversial topic, the opportunity zones. Are these a veiled way to perpetuate gentrification, or can they actually support our communities? Some people may not be familiar with opportunity zones, so you might need to put some background information in there.
So you want to give a shot at that?
Sure. Opportunity zones, for those who are unfamiliar, opportunity zones are a tool that came out not too long ago. They are targeted at low income or areas determined by each state, where you can invest dollars in lieu of paying capital gains tax. So it's thought to be that, by pulling this money out, investing it in the community, that it is helping to support these districts, that is also helping those people trying to avoid taxes to build wealth in other ways.
Right. So you want to share anything, Phillip?
Sure. I have mixed feelings about opportunity zones, and I think a lot of people do, but I think it kind of goes back to the general conversation, right? If you think layman's terms, how do we incentivize the right investments that are equitable, right? And then you have to ask yourself, are there enough rules and regulations tied to opportunity zone to kind of ensure that equitable processes are going to be made? And I think that's where you have to look at the policies that are tied to opportunity zones. Similar to CRA, Community Reinvestment Act, those kind of regulations around how banks have to put capital in certain communities based on where they have branches and physical locations. The question at the same time, even CRA is being under review right now. So you just have to ask again, are there enough rules and regulations and policies set so that someone can't maybe abuse the system, if you will, and not necessarily get the money where it needs to go? So I think the strength in opportunity zones is going to be what are the rules in place, and right now I'm just not sure what those rules and policies are right now. So yeah, I hope there's more to come, but it's just unclear.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more that needs to be done, obviously, and the other part of it is that you have to have development opportunities in the pipeline. When you talk about some of these harder to serve markets and underserved markets that have historically been that way, it's not like you have projects lined up, ready to go, looking for investment. There's a lot of money just flying around looking for somewhere to land, but you don't have projects lined up for a community that needs those jobs, need those business services. It's a tough go. Anyone else want to say anything on that before we go to the next question?
I was just going to add real quick, I think, Breanca, it looks like you are too, but I think the biggest challenge with things like opportunity zones, at least in Chicago, is that a lot of where these were landing was kind of predetermined before, Brian, to your point, the projects, the pipeline, and the opportunity. So like, had we just spent the time studying where these were to go, I think we would have had a much fairer distribution of where they landed, because it is not necessarily the local community that's being served by the fact that the opportunity zone, it's been very, I don't know if I should use the word predatory, but almost been predatory in terms of like people taking advantage of identified opportunity zones, as opposed to there being the projects in the pipeline and the existing need that's then being supported.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Monica on that. It just seems a bit like, not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but definitely these cycles of like the same groups being at the table to take advantage of the opportunity for good or for bad. And so we definitely have other places, even in Indianapolis, where, you know, they've been identified, but then who's the CDC that organization or that neighborhood is working with? Where are the resources there? So it's been identified. There's not a partner at the table. So who's really going to facilitate what that means to be an opportunity zone? And I think as we think about neighborhood development in particular, that a lot of our constructions, again, is like, who is this built for? As someone else said, is it built for the people who actually live there? Is it there to bring in people to do some stuff and maybe attract folks from outside of that neighborhood and eventually lead to other things like gentrification and such? And again, I know a lot of those studies have yet to be done, but I think at least on the ground, there's concern about who is getting the support to make sure that things are done in an equitable way. So just adding to what everyone else has already said.
That's a great point. Thank you, Breanca. Katie, we have another question.
Yes, and we can go all the way up to 4:50, so we can take quite a few more questions tonight.
Okay.
The next question is, many people do not fully understand how our political policies of the past have put us where we are today. In order to really move forward, how do we educate the public on the history so that they have the knowledge to help view policies moving forward that are equitable? Knowledge is power. This information is not currently taught in schools.
Well, I think ULI has some work to do on that front. What do you say? Some other organizations as well, but Breanca, you want to take that?
Yeah, I guess I'll say, at least my experience as being a Black student in K through 12 schools, that you're right, that's not always taught, but I think, you know, even things like this are helpful, right? It's not taught in schools, but if you are a parent on this call, then it's incumbent upon you to have those conversations with your kids. It's not the school's, it is the school's fault. But, you know, at a certain point, there is a level of, you know, implicit information that gets passed on even in households. When we talk about things like what school is a good school or what neighborhood is a good neighborhood, being able to deconstruct what that means requires a lot of, you know, knowledge and listening. So I think that that's the biggest thing is being able to do things. There are lots of forums like what we're doing right now, but there are tons of books, there are tons of podcasts, there are so many ways to just kind of jump into the information. Like I said, that's why it takes a long time for these things to change, because people have to, a lot of folks in this country, especially white folks, are reorienting their perspectives to a lot of things that I've grown up with are not actually okay, and they might actually systemically disadvantage people. So I think the only thing you can really do is just to listen to the communities that are being affected by some of these policies and just do as much as you can. There's so many resources now to jump into and be able to share that information with your family, with your friends and other folks to, you know, make it spread around as much as you can.
Yeah, that's great. I think another thing, and I'm gonna turn it over to Monica, but I think another couple of things. One is that's why it's important to diversify our institutions and make sure that we're inclusive and getting young people early. I think when we have more Black, Hispanic, and just more people of color involved in these organizations, they can certainly reach and educate. There are a lot of people who don't know about a lot of the different, you know, divisions of planning and different things around development as well. But if you tell people what food insecurity is. They can tell you if they're hungry. But then they can also help you maybe provide innovative solutions based on their lived experience. So we have to be able to connect those dots and make it meaningful for a younger generation and a younger generation of color. The other thing I would also say is that, you know, community engagement is somewhat what we call that tokenism piece. When you go into communities of color, it's really about community empowerment. And that's when you have that community education, community, you know, informing the community and what you can learn from them in the institutional history as well. And I think having those conversations, talk about what planning is, talk about what development is, what it means, what equitable development means, just the bringing the right wording, the right common language, that will help all of us become more educated and help to expand the field for more people to, you know, get more involved in it as well. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to share. But Monica, did you want to chime in on that?
I was, and actually I appreciate what you just said about sort of the terminology, the language, understanding. We've spent our entire summer with two research assistants from the University of Chicago exploring almost everything you just described, and we're struggling, right? We want to talk about tools and goals of equitable development in the communities that we work, and we can't even find the common language to have the conversation. So we will do our best is the most I can say, but because a lot of the terminology, the history, things that we saw in the film are not inherently known, then when we talk about things like community wealth building, which I think is absolutely critical to this conversation, we're not recognizing the background that is either preventing or could be eventually resolved to build the community wealth, right? And community wealth building, whether it's individual equity, like actually, you know, within a home, a house, a household, a property, whatever, or if it's community wealth building in terms of community assets, both of these are, if you are outside of the neighborhood that is impacted, you have a high percentage chance that you don't see it. I work in neighborhoods of color. I live in a neighborhood that's not so much of color, and the difference in dialogues between those two neighborhoods are night and day. And all around me in where there are less people of color, I'm realizing that nobody even knew to have these conversations, right? There was no, the idea of redlining, the idea of inequity in lending, it's like, well, I've always gotten loans when I've gone to the bank. It may prevent you from even understanding that the color of your skin or the neighborhood you live in is preventing you from getting those same loans. So we have to dial way back in this conversation.
Yeah, I think just to kind of build on that, really it's about, you know, deciding that you're willing to sacrifice social capital in your organizations to have conversations that might not impact you on a personal level, right? And I think that goes a long way, because at the very least, we just saw one of the many resources out there, segregation by design. That's something you can bring to your organization tomorrow. Say, hey, I just had a chance to watch this great video. I know we have a DEI committee, for example, or I know we have this council who's looking to do DEI work. I'd love to maybe bring this to have this conversation, or hey, you know, I'd love to maybe see if our team wants to do an equity audit, right? These are small steps that you can, as an individual, can choose to suggest to your organization or to your group, knowing that it might not be comfortable, and it's not ever going to be comfortable, right? And I think we have to just acknowledge that we have a privilege of kind of sitting on the sidelines, and we have to leverage the idea of going and having those uncomfortable conversations, knowing that it's going to benefit the entire community if you do.
Okay. Katie?
Thank you, Philip. I'm a huge fan of uncomfortable conversations. We're going to skip over Casey's question. For those who don't know, Casey Cordes is our recently elected president of ULI St. Louis, and that's a great question. We'll probably end on that one. The next question in line is, what do you think some of the most effective ways for big CRE companies which currently make most of their money from financing development that aren't necessarily equitable or that play into the existing system, to change their business practices to facilitate equitable land use? How can a big CRE make sure they are not facilitating gentrification.
Will I take that one? There's a lot there. Is there any piece of that that any of you would like to just take? That we can try to break this question down a little bit more.
Sure, I can start. I think first, that big CRE company has to want to do it, right? I think that requires their board, their CEO, their executives to want to do that kind of work. If that's not the case, then yeah, maybe it would take policies and regulations that limit how much capitalism they can enjoy. So I think we're in a capitalistic society, right? So I think capitalism is what drives how do you make the most money and increase the most profits for your shareholders. So I think if those shareholders are telling them, make as much money as you can, I don't see why they would want to continue or consider equitable development, right? And I think I say that, you know, just to be transparent, that it starts from the leadership level, starts from the shareholders saying that this is a priority for us. And we no longer want to try to maximize profits no matter what, right? There has to be some sort of guidelines there. So whether it's regulations or executive leadership choosing to make that stance, that's where it'll start.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in on any part of that question?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't mind adding something. So twofold. All of the terminology around equitable development that we're talking about comes into play. But when we talk about gentrification, I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. And I worked with a executive director in Englewood here in Chicago, and he made a really good point. He talked about economic diversity, right? He changed the conversation. He's like, economic diversity, bring it on, right? I will take economic diversity in Englewood. If increasing incomes of residents that are building on certain vacant lots or developing certain houses allows economic diversity, which means we can support the retail in our neighborhood, which means we can support the entrepreneurs, which means we can create more jobs in our neighborhood, bring it on. I think the challenge is, you know, gentrification is really tied to displacement, and we've got to work more on the social equity side, where we really work at how can we make change without can you change without displacement, right? And to companies that are looking at bottom lines in terms of profit specifically, you know, when you look at things like social capital and social equity, it doesn't mean there's no money there, but it may mean that the 12% return is a 10% or a 9% return, whatever it is. It doesn't mean you can't build, whether it's wealth within the community or wealth that's supporting the community, but you can do it in a way that you're actually building the community and not displacing or some of the other things we've been talking about.
Very good. Okay, next question, Katie.
Yes. Could you talk about the impacts of redlining on other issues, including environmental justice, climate justice, and public health?
That's a good one. Well, all the questions are good, but Breanca, you want to take a run at that?
Sure. So there's tons of research about, you know, not even necessarily redlining, but neighborhoods that are, you know, majority minority, particularly majority Black, and the implications of living there on your health. Greater rates of air pollution, greater rates of lead hazards in the soil, which leads to things like greater rates of asthma in some of these neighborhoods. So when we're talking about COVID-19 in particular, one of the first things that came out was, you know, Black people are definitely going to be at greater risk just because they're more likely to live in Black neighborhoods, which are more likely to have these types of environmental hazards that predispose them to some of those types of, you know, respiratory or other types of negative experiences health-wise. So there's tons of work suggesting that if you live in a neighborhood that is predominantly Black in particular, regardless of income, that those are very common experiences to have.
Great point, yes. Anyone else want to take a run at that?
Sure. Yeah, I think The Color of Law is a great book to just kind of read. I tend to cheat a lot. I just listen to audible.com, but for those who actually read the physical copy, you know, color of law is a great one. It walks through the idea that, you know, redlining also meant that certain plants, certain other community centers that maybe other communities didn't want in their neighborhoods were put in Black neighborhoods or in those neighborhoods that were redlined. So I think to Breanca's point, those decisions were intentionally made to put certain factories, certain things in Black neighborhoods because they knew of the health benefits or disadvantages by not having it in certain communities. So I think that's an important thing to just realize that that's tied to the environment, and, you know, redlining impacts more than just economics.
Yeah, it does. But, you know, when you have redlining, that's disinvestment. That disinvestment goes to things from, you know, having food deserts, health access deserts. And then what fills in is the food swamps, the convenience stores, the high salt, high sugar content. So redlining is a systematic process that leads to a lot of different things that adversely impact communities. And as I mentioned earlier, it does go to the social and physical determinants of health. Your zip code, unfortunately, can determine the outcome of your life. You know, Breanca mentioned before, pollution, that we have a lot of young people, particularly Black children, that have high rates of asthma, obesity, which leads to chronic diseases like kidney disease and certain forms of cancer, and so many different things that just result from redlining and disinvestment in general. Okay, Katie, next question.
Yes. So we're gonna get, these are gonna be the last two questions we tackled today. We'll hit Casey's question. What is one thing everyone listening today can do to advocate for in an effort to advance equitable development? So what is something that people can do today to advance equitable development?
I would say this isn't a particular cause, but I think a major hurdle, and Monica alluded to this, is to stop conflating race with income. I think it's a very easy thing for developers, folks in city government to do, and saying we're going to help these folks because they're lower income, and therefore by saying it's an economic issue, you can kind of avoid the race conversation. But as you saw in the video, and as everyone said so far, these outcomes aren't by happenstance. They're very much racially targeted, and it's impossible to kind of reverse things from a racial equity perspective without just acknowledging that it's a race problem and not just a race and income problem. When we look at majority Black neighborhoods, there are folks who live there who are attorneys and who are teachers and professionals. These aren't like low income people who are on food stamps like the stereotypes would have you believe. It's a very diverse place socioeconomically, and so to just kind of put some of these solutions as income-based strategies, I think really does a disservice to, again, the years of systemic policies that were targeted toward Black people and people of color.
Monica, what would you say is your something you want to leave in terms of what can people do now?
I think have the conversation at its most basic level. I think that there's an amazing, this is a conversation I had the other day with a friend. It's a shockingly amazing opportunity right now that you can have a conversation about lack of access, comfort in public spaces, ability to go outside. Everybody is impacted because of COVID right now. So all of a sudden, a lot of communities who've never experienced lack of access or been afraid to go outside or concerned about the environment, the air they're breathing, are experiencing this from a very visceral and personal level. So all of a sudden this conversation can occur in a different way, because in many of the communities we work in and many friends and colleagues, it's like, well, this is our reality, right? This has always been our reality. And a lot of people are waking up to this idea that our environment, our outside, is not necessarily safe or conducive to our personal health. So I think this is a really, really important time to have the conversation, in part, unfortunately, due to COVID, but I think it's allowing people to understand that discomfort caused for different reasons, but the fact that there is a discomfort and there's a lack of access to fresh air and all of these things is, I don't know. I've just really found that conversation has changed with the fact that there's so much restricted access right now.
Yeah, and I'll say briefly, maybe just, I mentioned earlier, track racial demographic data. I think you'll be surprised how few organizations actually track racial demographic data. And until you do that, you can't even tell the story of that race conversation. I think also, either find a consultant or find a group, neutral third party to do a true equity audit of your organization. Because I think until you start internally, it's tough to decide next steps until you really kind of come to terms with where you are as an organization. So.
Well, that's a good segue, Phillip, about measuring. You can't know where you're going or how effective you've been with these public statements and things you're trying to initiate unless you're able to measure it. I know we have a PhD up here, so I know Breanca certainly understands that as well. All right, Katie, how are we doing on time? And you want to go ahead and give some action items here?
Yes, I want to thank everybody for participating today. If your questions were in the chat box and we weren't able to get to them, we will answer them and post them to the WLI Summit website. We are going to be adding a resource page. With that in mind, our final question for the survey, or for our panelists today, will be coming in the form of if you would provide one link or resource you would recommend to the audience. So I'll give you a second to think about that. While we have that question out there, we also know that people in the audience have a ton of resources at their fingertips as well. So we encourage you to drop those into the Q&A. We know it's not going to be a question, but we'll be documenting and keeping track of all the resources that you drop into the question and answer box. We'll be adding those to the website and creating a resource page to use in the future. So I'd just like to go around and ask each panelist, if you had one resource you would recommend for the audience, what would it be? We'll start with Phillip.
Sure, yep. So I mentioned Color of Law. There's also a book called Color of Money that really speaks to the lending industry and kind of how that has been racially discriminate. But yeah, I think it's just taking the time to really look at those resources and then see where those resources take you, because those books are great books that'll mention other resources to check out. So kind of follow those leads.
I'm going to jump in with an audio, specifically a podcast. So there's a series of podcasts by Serial, which are all amazing. But there's one that's currently out right now called, I believe it's called Nice White People, but it's about the education system and access to schools in New York. And it's fantastic because it's very digestible, and it really goes at things like locations of school, access to schools, people's desires to have a public education, but then the reality of kind of what individual action and how individual action impacts the realities of the schools and where the schools are today. So it's using the current context to explore how we've gotten to where we are with the lack of integration in schools in the public education system.
I would recommend The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. She has a new book that's come out called Caste, which talks about race and how it's structured in the US. But I like The Warmth of Other Suns because it's very narrative, but it also talks about what it means to be a Black person coming usually from the Deep South to different parts of the country, including the Midwest, including places like Chicago, and just what that treatment was like. Because you think about and kind of overturning some of these policies and what that looks like, to just, again, kind of see what that was like in practice for people to essentially be treated like immigrants in their own country, to come to a new place and not have the systems and structures to support them in accomplishing things like homeownership or living in a quality, affordable rental that was happening decades and decades ago. And then we're still trying to break some of those cycles. So I think it's a good kind of historical perspective on some of that.
You're on mute, Katie. You're on mute.
Thank you. I was going to say, Brian, we'd also love you to add your 2 cents as a professor. You've got lots of resources.
I'm going to do a little bit different. I know this is not tapping out here, but the late Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, always said that all politics is local. I would say everybody on this webinar, just find a local book where somebody's written about the history of your community and figure out what you can do to help rectify any challenges. But again, I believe all things are local. So find something in your local community. Some author may have written about it, some neighborhood, some part of the community, how the city was formed, something in your history locally that will be important for you going forward.
Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you for the audience for joining us today. I want to thank Brian for his thoughtful guidance through this. Thanks to our panelists for being willing to share their experience and expertise with us. And also thanks to Bonnie, Kelly, and those at WLI and the ULI who have helped pull this together. A recording of this session is going to be made available on ULI's Knowledge Finder, and then we will also post it to YouTube. Our second session is scheduled for September 16th. Its title is Analysis. So be on the lookout for more information about that. As the title kind of lends itself to, we will be looking at how do we analyze race and equity and what tools are available to us to move that conversation forward. Today, we hope to establish a dialogue and set the foundation for meaningful change. Together, we can use our networks and our tools to move forward to a more just and equitable future. I invite you to join us to do the work, to imagine the incredible possibilities of what can happen when we have a more equitable built environment. And I want to thank you once again. We hope to see you in September.